Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to try to help scratch the surface here, but as we just heard, the schedule is tight. So I'm going to race through this and introduce you to our three panelists. Evgeny Morozov, a writer, researcher, and tech critic. Angela Aristidou, a lecturer at UCL's School of Management and digital fellow at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. And Alan Winfield, the world's first professor of robot ethics, and he tells me he describes himself as a professional worrier, which I suspect he has in common with some of you in your work. Right, so I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to remind you, I'm going to squint my eyes and remind you, you have 5 minutes each. Evgeny, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. What I would like to communicate to today is that AI, as we know it and as we've recognized it from the news in the past 12 months, is not here to stay. It will be very different in the years to come. Partly that has to do with the fact that there is a power struggle in society over the direction that's going to take. There are different groups, socioeconomic groups, geopolitical groups, and others who will not be happy with the concentration of power that has happened in the last year or so in Silicon Valley, but especially in the hands of companies responsible for generative AI and large language models. The tech clash that started in 2016 and then fizzled out a few years later would come back as Techlash 2.0, much of it driven, again, by concerns around AI. If one of the blockbuster independent films of the last year was How to Blow Up a Pipeline, a blockbuster film of the next few years might as well be called How to Blow Up a Data Center. I think the key thing to keep in mind is that the agreement that was reached last week between Hollywood studios and the screenwriters is an indication of things to come, because here you clearly see one group, in this case workers, managing to carve out limitations on how AI will be used by those who employ them, but also carving out some space for themselves on how they will be using AI. And I think it's a very interesting indication of things to come, but it will not just be a conflict between employers and employees. We'll see all sorts of other groups trying to push for their own control of some kind, of whether it's data or models or any other parts of the stack. And I think that the politicization of who controls data, who analyzes data, who curates data will be one of the key conflicts in the next few years. And that will not just apply, as I've said, to workers and employers, it will also apply to patients, patient groups of various kinds. If you look at medicine, it will apply to also various groups that we might not find particularly conducive to democracy, people denying science, vaccination, climate change, and what have you. All of them will, in their own right, demand somehow their own truth and their own version of large language models and the outputs that they're producing. We have already seen that, of course, with a lot of the far-right conservative critiques of the outputs of ChatGPT in the United States, with even people like Elon Musk promising to build their own version of Truth GPT or however else you would call it. I think we will see more and more such efforts and such fragmentation processes. Geopolitically, I don't think that a lot of countries will agree to having their generative AI services provided by the United States or by companies coming from the United States. I do expect that regions like Latin America, for example, will try to articulate a counter project of some kind. They do speak a common language, for example, and they do have some resources which they have put up online. Open access articles, for example, have been put online in places like Brazil and Argentina and elsewhere. And now, of course, all these articles have been analyzed, extracted, and consumed in a way by the likes of OpenAI. to produce services which are now being marketed back and sold back to the governments that have funded the research and that have funded the distribution of these articles online. I don't think that either the governments or the researchers and scientists like that. They too are going to push back. And I do think that we will see more and more politicization of AI, and we will see more national efforts to essentially try to build up nationally driven and politically driven frameworks for its development and also for feeding data into it. A lot of it has already been digitized and it exists in libraries and elsewhere. So my key takeaway is that the AI that has emerged in the last 12, 18 months and that we have seen in the newspapers and newspaper headlines is going to look radically different, and that the stack that we take for granted as being offered by open AIs of the world will also look radically different, and different parts of it will exist in different social groups, political groups. Some of it will exist in the state, some will exist in other institutions. Thank you so much.
My remit here for this first session was to keep things high level. Well, there you go. Right, Angela.
I'm going to follow up on that and talk about what I think is a passion of mine, which is to study artificial intelligence and human expertise in organizations. So what I do is more grounded in the sense that I study AI in the wild, AI when it's used in actual organizations by people in context. And in the past couple of years, my research team and I have made some observations that I think might carry forward into some interesting ideas for the conversations in this group. The first one is that, and I really hope I would leave you with this, that AI is a fantastic tool. It can be a very good team player in certain contexts. It is a horrible leader and a very bad strategist, until today, at least. So what I mean with that is that I see AI being used for horizon scanning, for the grudgery, for the work of pattern seeking and pattern matching, all of the stuff that we would expect from an excellent assistant. I see AI in teams that are hybrids, human AI hybrid teams, and I see how it has enhanced both their speed as well as the quality of their outputs. But what I also see is that AI is not yet in a position to ask the questions, to set the agenda, and to tell those teams what to do and how to do it, to examine which hypothesis to go after, for example, in biotech. All of that is the reason why I would say that it's not possible for AI at this point. And that's why the takeaway that I would have us leave with is that we should keep humans in charge at this point, at least, and AI should be in the loop. Now, the domain experts are the ones that I see in my context, the doctors, the ones who have the knowledge, but also the patients who are experts by experience. And they are the ones who are seeking the questions and setting the questions in the agenda. They have the unique skill sets and the socialized knowledge that can also interpret what the AI shows to them. And that's what takes me to the second takeaway, which is the following. Whether AI's outputs feed into the work of humans or whether humans and AI work together in hybrid teams, at the end of the day, the responsibility for the outputs of the AI and how that's used falls on the shoulders of humans. That is true in the physical world when the AI gives you weather prediction. It also holds true in the physical world when the AI folds a protein. What you do with it is in the shoulders, it's up to the humans that are involved in that situation. But the same holds true and even more true when the AI gives you some sort of output that can have an influence in the social realm. And the reason is that when it comes to the physical world, we have some sort of way of assessing what is the truth. We have some notion of what is a right and wrong answer. Either it rains or it doesn't, either it folds or it doesn't. But when it comes to the social world, and I will agree with Evgeny on this, that it is very difficult to come up with a ground truth. It is not easy to decide what is a right answer because of all the reasons that we heard. It's culturally dependent, it's intermixed with geopolitical situations, it's very specific to the context. So where does this take me as an organizational researcher is that I would like to put forward the idea that because it's so important to have people who are able to interpret the AI's outputs, we should actually invest in the human experts, and we should put in place not only their training, but also the organizational processes to enable them to have the ability to ask the right question and to have the ability to interpret and judge the outputs of the AI. So that's my second takeaway. And I hope that's going to lead into some interesting Q&A.
Thank you very much. And with time to spare, for which I'm grateful. Alan?
Thank you very much indeed, Jason. So apart from worry, what does a roboethicist do? Well, we develop ethical principles to guide the way that robots and AIs are designed and deployed in society. Principles are important, they're not practice. So we need processes to bridge the gap between good intentions and good practice. We develop methods and tools for values-driven design. We draft new ethical standards in robotics and AI. And I'm a volunteer with both the British Standards Institute and the IEEE Standards Association. And I've helped to draft several published ethical standards in robotics and AI. And thirdly, we advocate for the adoption of these principles, methods, and standards, and if necessary, new regulation. For me, that means speaking often with parliamentarians, as well as advising both research projects and companies. I was, for instance, for some years on the Ethics Advisory Board for the EU flagship Human Brain Project. Very powerful framework for responsible AI is called ethical governance. It's a set of processes, procedures, cultures, and values designed to ensure the highest standards of behavior. But it goes beyond simply good, in other words, effective governance, in that it inculcates ethical behaviors in both designers and the organizations in which they work. Now, I've mentioned values several times. These are, of course, human values. AIs don't have values. All robots and AIs must be designed to interact with humans. Thus, ethical governance must be human-centric. Yes, of course, we need to ensure that technology is safe and reliable, but even more important is how humans respond, react, and interact. But computer scientists, software engineers, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how brilliant, simply do not have the skills, training, or mindset to consider the human factors. I think I'm reflecting Angela here. Imagine a small team developing a new medical diagnosis app. They may be brilliant, but a team of 20-something young men will develop an app that reflects their values. But presumably they would like their app to be used by women, by middle-aged people, and by people from diverse ethnic backgrounds. As Caroline Priado-Perret exposed in her brilliant book, Invisible Women, there is a bias in the world designed by men. And that bias is especially acute in medicine and healthcare. The solution to this inherent bias is not difficult. It means putting together design teams that are both gender balanced and reflect the age and ethnic diversity of the target users. And furthermore, the team must be led by human factors, not technology, and should include people with backgrounds in psychology and, of course, medicine. Such a team needs tools, and the most powerful, in my view, is ethical risk assessment. In a nutshell, ethical risk assessment is a method for brainstorming everything that could possibly go wrong, which is a lot. The first British standard I worked on, BS 8611, published in 2016, is a method for ethical risk assessment. And earlier this year, ISO, the International Standards Organization, published ISO 23894, which is AI, a guidance on risk management. The good news is that tools exist. They exist. So what kind of risks am I talking about? Ethical risk assessment typically covers several broad categories. Risk to the individual. In the case of our medical diagnosis app, this includes the user, that is the patient, and the clinician, who may be interpreting the app's recommendations for the patient. BS 8611 covers, for instance, the risks of deception addiction, over-trusting. Then there are societal risks to jobs, inequality, and data protection. And the third category is commercial or financial risks. The fourth, and equally important, are risks to the environment. I've already mentioned the inherent biases that design teams might unwittingly build into their systems, simply reflecting their values, but AIs may also inherit explicit biases from the training data sets. So ethical risk assessment must take great care to examine and mitigate that particular risk. If you remember two things from me this evening, they are, I hope, human-centric design and ethical risk assessment. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Let me start there. Your take home then is that it's just simply good business to consider the ethics at the outset, and not only that, there's a packet of materials out there for you to do so. It's not starting from a blank slate.
I think it's more than good business. I think it's being good human beings. But yeah, the point is, I certainly wanted to get that over, that you're not starting from zero. And in fact, you've given me an opportunity to say that I've published several papers.
I'll just stop you.
No, seriously, case studies on how to do ethical risk assessment. And the most recent was a hospital disinfectant robot. So there are examples that you can use. You're not just starting from zero.
Right. But what I guess your argument is that by handling some of the ethical stuff, then you kind of automatically deal with or preempt some of the regulatory stuff. Angela, I know you think a lot about regulation. I'm just kind of wondering, I suppose, how to anticipate in a sector where regulators play such a strong role. How to find the roadblocks, the bumps in the road along the way. You say, for example, do a risk assessment early. It's easy. The tools are out there.
Didn't say it was easy.
Oh, right. It's hard, but it's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, fair enough.
Yes.
Angela, what do you reckon?
I'm going to say it is easy. I'm going to say go find the domain experts. So in healthcare, where I do my studies, the domain experts are usually the doctors. So the doctors can tell you most likely what are going to be the most likely risks in deploying an AI tool or an AI system. When talking to radiologists about the deployment of a tumor detection tool here in the UK, they could come up with a list of items that they would like to have answers on before they would touch the tool. And that list corresponds really well with the new nice guidelines on AI implementation in healthcare, which came out more than 6 months after my questions to those doctors. So find the domain experts. The domain experts will likely know where the key points are you should focus on. And the second thing that I would suggest is to allow people to use the tool in real settings, because that is the only way you can uncover the risks in a controlled way, in a way that sets in place boundaries and guardrails. And yes, there is a lot of work being done from the bottom up, which I call anticipatory governance. The idea that the FDA and all these organizations are working towards developing those very important policies and guidelines, but at the same time, we in the front lines have to find ways to use these tools because we actually see value in using them. How are we going to bridge that gap between where we are now today and where the FDA might want us to be in a year's or more time? That is the anticipatory aspect of it.
What interested me as I was listening to all three of your talks is you basically kind of all talked about human factors in one way or another, matters of geopolitics, matters of ethics, matters of team building, what have you. And no one got into the nuts and bolts on the data that underlies a lot of this. I mean, all of the talk about AI. And I'm keeping it a high level, don't worry. But Evgeny, you said that this is, the future of AI is definitely not going to be the current AI. The world that revolves around it now is going to change. How is that going to change these kinds of discussions for the benefit of the kinds of people who are in this room? A different AI, more fragmented, more land grabbing, and so on. What changes in the landscape?
Sure. Well, I think we have to assume that global providers of AI services that are multi-purpose, like OpenAI, for example, they will have a very, very hard time. In part because since their entire rhetoric is so open-ended and multi-use, it's very hard to deploy the kind of ethical tests that are domain-specific, because the whole rhetoric is that it works in any domain, and it works as good for detecting cancer as it does for producing fake news out of Montenegro, right? And I think it just will be, we have to prepare ourselves for the fact that there will be pressures on governments to do something about both the kinds of data that go into this, but also to add probably pressure on governments to do something about the free flow of data. There's been a slogan for the last 40 years that data should flow freely across borders. And we assume that there are all sorts of benefits to trade and to the economy and et cetera. And now, as we are kind of living this post-globalization moment, there is an extra complication. The fact that, this free flow of data greatly benefits some. And those some happen to be those who have invested billions into the infrastructures that can actually make sense of that data, right? Which also redefines a lot of other traditional talking points. A lot of people have been campaigning for opening up data, right? And to making government data more accessible, making scientific data more accessible. And now I think if the realization is that there are just 3 or 4 global players in the US and China who are going to come and suck all of it in, I do expect there will be pressure towards closing up some of the data that has been opened up.
Well, but I mean, there's a certain closing or a closed nature of the data at the outset when we talk about, in particular, health and medical data, right? Sure. Much deeper questions about ownership and also kind of sanctity, right? People Sure. are rightly protective, I suppose. That changes the discussion again. And I think something you guys have both thought about as well.
It depends on the pre-existing structures that are in whatever government you're discussing. So in the UK, the assumption is that the patient data belongs to the NHS. It belongs to the patients at first, and it's guarded by the NHS. So getting access to that, a company has to go through certain steps, and there are guardrails around that. In other countries, that's not always the case. So the way that I would like to see it go forward is to have data trusts where the data is positioned as an independent entity in a database, and then anybody with a good idea to train an algorithm can access them with some safeguards in place to train the specific algorithm that they applied for or they want to put forward. That's what I would like to see personally.
Yeah, and training a neural network from data scraped from the internet is just bad engineering. It's like having a beautiful engine, precision engine, that's the neural network, and you're just feeding garbage into the fuel tank. And the truth is that, of course, when you go to the medical regulator to get approval, they're going to want to know that you've curated your training data sets. That means that you cannot just scrape data from the internet. You shouldn't anyway, but you simply won't be able to if you want to get approval.
There are some big companies you should say that to. I made a promise that I would seek questions from the audience before too much time passes. Has anybody got a burning question? Is everybody a little bit shy early in the proceedings?
Yeah, I have just a quick question, and I shouldn't be the one to ask it, but how does the time horizon for all of these policies map to what's actually happening? So everybody's already using these tools right now without regulations. It's a bit like in other industries, right? Crypto, once things were coded, it became law, and we still haven't regulated it. So, I'm wondering if we're talking about this 10-year, long process, despite all the good intentions of trying to nail down policies and regulations now.
Well, I think on my end of the spectrum, a lot of pressures will come from the bottom up, and they will happen in the next few years, in part because people will be squeezed out of their jobs. I mean, think about a profession like a translator. I do talk to translators now, and they basically are very angry because a lot of the texts that they have been translated now are being fed into models, and then new services are being built with those data sets, and they're completely excluded from it. And the model that they would like to have in place, the socioeconomic model, not the technical one, would probably function around the idea of a data cooperative or data trust of some kind, where someone else, maybe the state, maybe some other actor, will provide the model, but the data that will train the model, the text that they have translated in the past will be brought by them, and they will be the ones capturing the value. And I do expect that these people will be pushing for changes the way taxi drivers were pushing against Uber, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I can't imagine that not happening in the next 18 to 24 months.
And the grassroots movement for more policy or expedited policy also will come from professional bodies. For example, doctors refuse to use AI because who's responsible if something goes wrong? And insurance companies, because they don't know how to bill for AI together with human teams, expertise or tasks that have been done in a combination of AI and human, and hospitals themselves. So all of the healthcare ecosystem is pushing for the regulators to give us something in writing that we can draw on. But at the same time, they are putting in place internally those scaffolds that are going to give them enough space to use it, at least in some experimental settings, until that regulation comes through. But the bottom line is, I would not be surprised to see a strict policy or a specific policy coming down in the next year.
Alan, you seemed like you had something to add.
Well, I just wanted to say that it's a myth that there is no regulation for AI. In this country, for instance, if you use AI in the workplace and there's an accident, then the health and safety executive will want to investigate that accident. Don't assume that there is no regulation. There is regulation. And as Angela rightly said, insurance companies are actually very powerful de facto regulators.
Apologies for international guests being introduced to all of these government agencies in Britain. We should have given out sort of a fact sheet to start. Angela, I know that you think in particular about sort of successful approvals and the like while we're on this notion of what regulators do. What lessons have you drawn about the companies that have done this right at the outset, the sort of hindcasting? Success stories started how? What did they do that a lot of companies fail to do?
Okay, so keeping the audience specifically in mind, I would say that those companies involved the domain experts from the beginning, and they built their plan around existing professional guidelines. So if you are in the field of healthcare, you want to look at whatever the Professional College of Radiologists has said on that topic. You want to look at whatever it is that was done anyways in that field without AI, and try to map your processes and your product as closely as possible to match those processes and those things that are already considered to be good practice in that field. The second thing that they have done is to have independent testing of it. So building something on your own is very exciting. Try to partner with either universities or with other bodies, nonprofits, that might provide that more independent view of what it is that you're producing and precisely maybe show some of the blind spots of it. And the third thing was that they went through the strictest process right now, which is the EU one. And I say that as a good thing. I know at the time they were not very happy about it, but going through that makes it so much easier then to scale up and diffuse anywhere else in the world, because it is considered to be the strictest one. So it's easy to make the argument that having gone through that, I am in a good place to be considered for expedited review in your country.
Right. Okay. Have we had any hands going up yet? I can't actually see. Please.
Hi, I'm Miro Gaspar, Sensible Biotechnologies, and thanks for a wonderful discussion. And one thing came to be very interesting to me. So essentially, with the AI, and here we operate in a world of bits. All of us here in the biotech are operating in a world of atoms, you could say. And it seems to be that we are operating on a different time scale. So, for example, almost we could take an AI algorithm and flipping the objective function. Instead of designing the safest and most effective drugs, we're designing the most dangerous drugs. And suddenly for us to come in and, in our case, make high quality mRNA for the next vaccines to prevent these terrible pandemics, well, it's going to take a lot of time. We have to go through these clinical trials, CMC, GMP development, and all of these terrible acronyms, which are obviously very important, but we are essentially operating to stop the trend. We are operating on a vast different timelines, just as with disinformation. It's much easier to come up with some rubbish than to defeat it. And my question to you would be, what are we going to do about it? How can we put these kind of security guards, not just for the people who are, have all good intentions, but we are trying to make sure that the algorithm doesn't go out of the boundaries, versus the cases where people actually have a terrible intentions and are trying to do harm? How do we reconcile all these timelines?
Who wants that one?
I think you should put a poster on your wall, good intentions are not enough, and look at it every day.
I suppose you could say that, there are always going to be bad actors. And that's where we do need regulation. We need, and we have standards already. There's no shortage of standards, but we need regulation, yes.
So to add to that, there are out there instructions on how to make very effective poisons on the internet. So putting out an algorithm that creates something that might be potentially harmful is not something new in itself. But the key thing there is that even if those are out there, and even with AI, they might be more widely spread, what remains still a fact is that not everybody who potentially wants to use those in a bad way has a wet lab that can turn that into something that they can use to harm people. So they don't have the facilities, and they might not have the domain expertise to turn that into something truly harmful. So I'm not as worried about it personally. Now, what do you do with it? What I have seen done very effectively is that once you have something that you might want to put out to the world, you put together a team, a focus group, an interdisciplinary focus group, people who are not computer scientists, preferably. And you ask them, what do you see as the potential harms of this? And what do you suggest we put in place to mitigate that? It might be an extra step that seems a bit painful, but it is an extra step that might save you a lot of regret later in time. That's what I would suggest.
Right. I have so many more questions, but it's okay. I'm sitting next to you at dinner. And I promised I would be very rigorous about timekeeping. So for the moment, can we thank our panelists, Alan, Angela, Evgeny?